civil society. The event serves as a melting pot of insights and ideas shared by our esteemed speakers. Today here we have James Cameron, Violet Shivutse, Jessie Worker, and Apurva Oza. My name is Yasmina Haynes, and as Integrity Action CEO, I will speak on behalf of the organization. I will soon hand over to James, who will moderate the event. But before I do so, I will properly introduce all of our speakers and hopefully make them blush, and very rightly so. How many of us would love to be able to connect law, policy, finance, and innovation in addressing environmental challenges? Well, although not a Hollywood actor, James Cameron does it all. James is currently an executive fellow at the Yale Center of Environmental Law and Policy, Research and Life fellow at a number of universities, including Oxford and Cambridge. He's also a senior advisor at Howden, Korn Ferry, Pollination Global, Worthwhile Capital Partners, and many others. He's also a chair of Crown Agents. If you think this is impressive, please try looking at his website for a full list. I highly recommend so. Violet has been at the forefront of mobilizing, inspiring, and leading thousands of women farmers in Kenya to address resilience and justice. Violet has created channels and ensured that governmental leaders, financial leaders, development leaders have heard and responded to what women farmers want and need. She has founded and leads Shibutse Community Health Workers Organization. Welcome, Violet. Moving on to Jessie. First time I've heard Jessie speak and first time I met him. He led World Resources Institute initiative, the Access Initiative. It was certainly then, and I think probably still today, one of the largest civil society networks globally dedicated to ensuring that citizens have the right and ability to influence decision makers about natural resources that sustain their communities. Today, Jessie is an acting director of environmental democracy practice at WRI. Apurva, last but not least, I'm personally, and loads of people who have met me have heard this from me. I'm a huge fan of Aga Khan Foundation. Their impact and deeply rooted commitment to communities is very, very impressive. How many organizations do you know who have made a promise to communities to see them through thick and thin over 70 years? But meeting Aga Khan people makes you understand where the true power of the organization comes from, and Apurva is definitely an excellent example. He is their global lead in agriculture and climate change and has led a string of impressive positions in India in multiple different organizations. Now, I will, just before I hand over to James, I have been reminded to share with you, if you have any technical issues, if you can't hear us, if you can't see us, if anything happens, please use chat function to let us know, and hopefully we will sort it out. At this point, I hand over to James and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Yasmina. That's very, very kind and very pleasing to be together with you all, albeit remotely and online. One of the things I thought we would try and do is enable the speakers to get out their essential idea to share with you all, almost like their sort of platform speech to you briefly, and then I will come back and ask them questions that will keep a dialogue going between all the four presenters. So we'll start with Jessie, we'll then go to Violet, and then Apurva, and then Yasmina. One of the things I would like to sort of draw attention to, and it's partly because of my own background, having worked initially anyway on the law relating to carbon markets, and then through Climate Change Capital and various other organizations figuring out how to invest behind a price for carbon, just to test out with our speakers how to make the system that we're talking about have integrity how to make it do the things that it ought to do to deliver the public good. So that'll be the general tone of our conversation. But let me begin with Jesse to set out his proposition, his way of contributing to advancing the voluntary carbon markets through green accountability. Jesse, over to you for your intro.
Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here and be on with such an esteemed panel. My point of entry for this conversation, the work that we do in the Equity and Governance Center at the World Resources Institute, is largely based on securing rights-based approaches for environmental, climate, forest governance. And my team has worked for many years, as you heard, through the Access Initiative, our coalition of civil society organizations in 60-some countries, to help strengthen the strong and complete comprehensive rights to accessing information, participation, and access to justice, and then ensuring that the politics and resources support their implementation. We also have a team that I work closely with that I will mention because it's very relevant to this conversation, that has worked with indigenous peoples and local communities on securing community land tenure. And where I'm coming at this then is from the more of the supply side integrity of how do we ensure that there are procedures and practices in place that communities, that indigenous peoples and local communities can have full participation throughout the decision making of a carbon credit scheme, and ensure that they are able to determine what kind of shared benefits and can be produced and how those can be distributed equitably. There's, I think, strong evidence from the most recent VCM, the most recent VCM report, that there's high demand for projects that have that distribute co-benefits. And so we know from our own research that the state of FPIC, of free, prior, and informed consent implementation, for instance, is very scattered in terms of what we know about how the measures that are being taken to implement it. We know that it's a human right that needs to be implemented, and it's absolutely critical to ensure that that communities have a stake in, or have a clear claim and ability to influence where these projects are taking place, and where there are approaches that apply a jurisdictional approach, which is the scale at which we think is critical to ensuring integrity, rather than to ensure additionality, reduce leakage, and promote permanence at a jurisdictional approach that may also align well with indigenous territories. So we have there's plenty of history and practice on how to implement procedural rights more effectively. And I think we need to draw upon that in terms of both ensuring that the knowledge, the parameters of carbon credit purchases are fully shared in advance, and that there's full-scale participation for communities to being able to help determine the terms of these credits. So happy to talk more about the work, and just also to reflect on that WRI has our body of work of my colleagues has been mostly around nature-based solutions for volunteer carbon markets. And we have produced recently with partners the Tropical Forest Credit Integrity Guide for companies. And in that was produced, including with IPAM Amazonia and COICA, the coordinator for indigenous communities in the Amazon, that really outlines clearly how FPIC should be applied to carbon credits, to the volunteer carbon market. And I finally just want to end with, it is fully understandable that in the last few years, especially I think in the broader public, but also with buyers, that there's been a real questions of trust and integrity. But we have to recognize that this is the amount of the hundreds of billions of finance that is needed to support tropical forest, to reduce deforestation in tropical forests, means that we need to work to improve, to strengthen integrity. It's critical that even if it's not going, VCMs do not have the scope to provide all of that finance, that the contribution they can make is critical to reaching the climate goals that we all share. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Jesse, that's great, because in the end, the challenge is to make the money flow, but flow to the right places in the right circumstances. And I want to just examine a little bit more with you. It will certainly get picked up with our two next speakers. What sort of thoughts have you got about how to make the process attractive for investment, whilst also protecting the interests of those who might be quite vulnerable in the face of investment from outside their country, say? I'm really interested to know what thoughts you've had about how to get that balance right, so that the procedural rights are protected, the sometimes customary rights, not even protected in national law, are properly listened to. The knowledge, we'll get to Violet in a moment, the knowledge that's there in these communities. What have you learned, and what would you suggest about how to get that alignment between good process and attractiveness at the right level of risk for investors?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I appreciate that you brought up the customary rights and not only legally recognized rights, because we know that there are many millions of hectares of land that have customary rights attached to them that may not be always respected by government authorities. We of course know that the integrity of forests, when tenure rights are respected and enforced, is much higher. There's numerous studies over the past decade that have shown that. So James, to your point, we have WRI worked with many partners to launch the Landmark platform, the Landmark tool, which shows where it provides a map of interactive maps showing lands held by Indigenous peoples and local communities, including the pressures that they face and the contributions that they make towards managing the environment. So this includes both land use, land cover and change. It includes legally recognized lands and lands occupied by Indigenous peoples and local communities, the best estimates of which are up to 50% of the world's land. So just it's quite a figure.
Yeah.
And I think what we have found over the 9 years, and it's about to be relaunched with additional data and interactivity in September. What we found, though, over the last 9 years was there was a real demand from companies to understand, were they getting accurate information from governments about where lands that they might be interested in, either for concessions or for carbon credits or other uses, were they actually being used by Indigenous peoples and local communities? So it provided a real third-party verification for where there might be serious legal or reputational risks for those companies. And so that is one platform that I think is really important. And then I think to work through directly with civil society organizations and Indigenous people organizations and communities directly. I think there's a good question about where the resources come to ensure that FPIC is adequately resourced, because there is potentially a perceived or real reputational risk if it's just coming from the buyer. So to think creatively about where those resources are provided to ensure that there is that communities have the training and capacity to fully negotiate those terms and have the ability to withdraw if those terms are not met.
Okay, we're going to move on to Violet in a second, but just a couple of things for the audience to hold in mind as we go through the next phase. Big emphasis here on fair negotiating. Big emphasis on data, understanding what it is through mapping or some other process, so that not just the sort of geophysical attributes that you want to invest in, but also the overlapping rights and duties that exist in a particular part of the world. And of course, it will vary. And also to be sure that when you're making risk calculations, you're fully informed. And that's where your professional advisors, whoever they are, or your domestic institutions, if you're working with or a local community or with a government, are properly informed and know all the rights and duties that are in play in a transaction of this type. Now, that's a good link because I know what Violet has been doing. Violet, why don't you just give your introduction to the things that really matter to you, and then we'll keep this conversation going, but maybe particularly around land rights and marginalized communities that do need to be heard.
Thank you so much, James, and thank you everyone for getting this opportunity to be speaking in this meeting and on a very important session. So just as you heard from my introduction, Shibuya Community Health Workers has been working with women farmers for more than 1.5 decades. And when we started experiencing climate change, there was a very big impact on food security and nutrition at family level. So being an organization that works with farmers, not just for production, but also to ensure that women are fulfilling their role as caregivers because they have a task to bring food on the table, we mobilized women in groups so that they could be able to start addressing issues of land degradation to ensure that land was fertile. So the women for almost 8 years have been doing activities related to composting, agroforestry, vegetation in their farm, just making sure that the soil is fertile and that they can be able to produce enough for their families and reduce the impact of climate change whenever it comes. That has worked very well. We have worked successfully with other partners who are interested in supporting agricultural activities. We have even worked to strengthen partnership between the women and government extension service to ensure that we can learn from each other and promote the technologies that are actually working using the experience and the struggles of women. One of the biggest struggles that we had for a period of time was accessibility to land. And as an organization that works at the community level, we used some of the experiences the women had around inheriting land, leasing land, to come up with streamlined ways that enable women and youth to access land for agriculture. So the carbon credit companies started coming to our communities, speaking to governments, and their main interest has been to register farmers who have been doing these activities and accumulated carbon in their land through these technologies so that they can be able to engage in these carbon credit activities. Things that have actually become a very big concern for us as a community-based organization is, one, there has been no clear information on the amount of carbon values. For example, how much are we selling or how much are we buying and how exactly are we buying? So using these organized groups of grassroots women, these carbon credits are registering women as individuals, but also registering the collective group. So the two of them, you sign a consent as a farmer, but you also sign a consent as a group. So 25 members together are signing a consent on engaging with these carbon credit organizations. The problem with this is that most of these women are leasing land or are using land that belongs to their families. So when the carbon credit companies are registering, they want the real owner of the land. Yet the women are the ones that have been doing this technology. So it means already the women are losing out in this issue of benefit sharing. The women are not being included in the people that are signing as we wait for these carbon credit markets to start happening, women being beneficiary, that one is being closed down. The other thing is that we have women that are coming along the forest of Kakamega. I come from an area, my home is 4 kilometers from the forest. So these women have been conserving the forest. There was a time when this forest was really encroached. And because as women from indigenous communities in Kakamega and in another area where we call Mount Elgon, where the women are feeding from the forest, vegetables and fruits from the forest, the women have really been conserving the forest, planting the forest to get herbs and whatever. But now the government is stopping the women from going to the forest and the communities living along the forest, because the carbon credits that they are signing with these companies, they don't want the communities to be the direct beneficiary in this. So that has been a challenge. So the biggest challenge we have is contracting. It's also women being denied accessibility to land, because land is a very big issue. And we have done a very progressive work in supporting women to access land, but the carbon credits now are posing a very big risk in us losing these gains that the women had because of on how they are doing the business. The issue of contracting, as I said, does not involve the women. The women are not participating in decision making, neither even in getting the information on how are these projects going to work. The other thing that what we decided to do is we have a tool that we call Haki Ardhi, where you help women to document on a toll-free number violations that are happening around land, where they are not accessing justice or where they have been violated to access agricultural land. So we are using this same model to replicate in the carbon credits, where women are able to report using a toll-free number on the violations they are experiencing, the exploitations they are experiencing, and even being displaced from the land, so that we can use this information when we are sitting with government and these carbon credit companies and other stakeholders to show the trend and even show the consequences on how women are losing, but also to ensure that as we will be using this information to shape trends and policies and processes that are happening, we are also able to support these women to access justice. This is a tool that we have put in place. The other thing that we are looking at is how we will ensure that women are really playing a key role as important agents in storing this carbon, to be recognized as key players and participate in decision making and even in policy influencing. We are looking at the policies around land, the policies around forest, including how the forest association groups are made and participation of women in these institutions, so that the women can be able to have their voice in the carbon credit organizations, in the carbon credit business that is happening. The issue of accountability is a very big issue. In this process, you just hear these companies, you don't see them. They either have an agent that they have contracted that is coming to register the farmers that will be doing business on their behalf, but they are not introducing themselves. No one knows their name as they come on the ground. No one knows their name. So you don't know whom to hold accountable. I'm really happy that Jess has mentioned about if you want to get out of this contract as a farmer, or even when women want to complain, what is the process of disconnecting this contract when you don't want to continue? You don't know whom you are going to continue. My own perspective and my organization is the way these carbon credits are happening is like a favor to the people that have accumulated this carbon, that have been working. But I think it would be better if this is really positioned not as an award, but as a compensation. So the moment we put it as a compensation, then we can be able to start looking at what do we mean when there is no compensation, because someone has worked for this. How much are you compensating? How are you compensating? How do you ensure that the person that has worked has the knowledge that they require to know in the kind of compensation that you are doing to them. Because we are still continuing to do, we still want our land to be fertile. So there is no way, even when you tell the women to stop, they will not stop because they want to continue seeing their land fertile. In this process, they're increasing the carbon in the soil, which the carbon credit market then becomes even more happy and makes a lot of money. So this is how we are looking at. How do we put this carbon credit really together with the issue of land tenure, rights, the people being at the center of organizing around the carbon credit, but also ensuring that resources are shared equally or are shared in a more meaningful way, that everyone is making profit or everyone is being compensated for what they have actually contributed, and the communities are playing their key role. These are the questions that we have actually been asking ourselves. Recognizing the contribution of women is also very key, and it's what we are advancing as women organizations, among others. Thank you.
Thank you, Bharat. I wanted to just ask you whether you've seen some good examples, or is your experience all negative at the moment, of how you would organize the proper participation of the groups that you're referring to, including obviously your own, so that a transaction that would bring real benefit to your community, because the work that you are doing should be rewarded. If you store carbon in soils, you're performing a valuable function, not just in that particular place, but we want carbon to be stored in soils. It's a public good. It's something that we all should value. And the whole point of having carbon priced or valued is that kind of work is rewarded. So what experiences have you got where this works well, or have you got a particular example from where you are, what you'd like to see happen that we could perhaps encourage other people to adopt?
Currently, I don't want to say that I've seen where it's working well. It's still really we haven't met the best practice,
yeah.
But our own experience in how we have been able to ensure that the grassroots women articulate and understand land tenure systems. They understand how to report when their rights are violated, and that this data that we are collecting, Jesse also mentioned about data. This data that we are collecting can be put together to help inform the government on the gaps in planning and in even policy implementation and in issues of climate change adaptation. This is what we have thought will be the best way. First, ensure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry?
No, go ahead.
First, ensure that we give the right information. So we have an 15 months program in one of the areas where we have so many carbon credit companies, which I didn't mention. The other thing is that there are many that they even confuse those communities.
Yeah.
So we have made a 15 months work plan to document right from registration of farmers up to sensitization, to ensure that we are going to have dialogues to influence how these processes are working. We are also engaging duty bearers, because these are the very important stakeholders that we have on the ground, to know their role in how they have been working and signing contracts with these carbon credit organizations, so that they can actually be able to share with the community what their role is and how to ensure communities can have space to engage in these discussions. So the women that have also been violated on carbon credits are going to be part of this process. We are also forming organizing with the litigation organizations that will provide justice in areas where we have violations around land, to make sure that the cases are reported and addressed through this litigation organization. So what we are framing is a multi-stakeholder approach, both to ensure dissemination of information, to streamline the process, but to make sure that there is accountability in this process that is happening. So that's the approach that we are using.
Right.
So we are going to use this toll-free number to ensure these cases are reported, but also use this information in making sure that what I've talked about is happening.
Excellent.
So documentation is a key thing. We do not have. In many places, people are not documenting these things. They are not even documenting which organizations and how they are working.
Well, I know that there are people on this call who, from the investment community, would know that that increases risk to them as investors. So that it should work out that a better run process that has clear procedural rules provides a more secure and trustworthy marketplace for investors.
Yeah.
But you're also highlighting the need not just to run good processes, but to have trusted intermediaries to ensure that the flow happens in the right way. Yeah. Well, let me move now to Apurva, and I know you in many respects are a trusted intermediary. You've done fantastic work with community farmers in India. Apurva, why don't you have your platform presentation now? Thank you.
Thanks, James. No, I think Violet has covered the dilemma faced by rural communities brilliantly. And I think it's and what she's done is so inspiring. AKF works in very diverse contexts. We work in the mountain regions of Central Asia. We work in coastal regions of Africa and Asia. We work in river plains in India. We work in semi-arid regions. And in all these places, we've seen climate has a huge effect. And the communities are a part of a very unjust transition, is that they've hardly contributed to the emissions, but they're facing some of the worst effects of climate change everywhere. You heard about the floods in Pakistan recently. All of that is part of what's happening now. Now, what we saw, and a lot of my conversation is based on the work we did in India, is that for the last, let's say about 5-6 years, suddenly non-profits and farmer communities have been, approached by a large number of what we call project developers and consultants, and they've been offering sometimes very unbelievable deals to farmers, and farmers are confused. Non-profits are confused because they are familiar with the world of either microfinance or the world of grants. They are not familiar with this new world, where first of all you have time dimensions of 20 years commitment, that something will be maintained for 20, 30, 40 years. They're not sure, they don't understand the kind of contractual obligations and the many players which are there in this whole value chain of carbon finance. And we saw a lot of in a way a lot of the worst parts of carbon financing played out in some areas where fly-by-night operators came, they promised many things, communities committed, and then suddenly the money didn't come. They were a lot of the data was, which they gave very, gladly because they thought it would yield some benefit, and then that data being sort of not used properly. So we thought that that this is getting to be an area where there is this huge information asymmetry between one of the key stakeholders in this whole climate space, which is the community. So that every other player seems to have much more information, far greater sophisticated understanding of the fund flows, and the community is very is left out of this thing. So along with some academicians and other civil society actors, we set up an organization, or a sort of a division, which is a very complicated name. It's called CGEM, which is the Center for Grower-Centric Eco-Value Mechanisms. In short, what it basically does, it takes the position on behalf of farmers and rural communities, all those who are involved in these nature-based solutions of carbon sequestration, etc., and explains this whole thing to them, and then bats in a way on their behalf. And then as we got involved, first we realized that this is a world in which the contracts and the consultants are all English-speaking people, and you have communities who are, they speak the Hindi or the Marathi. So first there's the language barrier. Nobody really understands what's happening. The second thing we realized that this whole education of what is carbon financing is not there. So a lot of work we did was just educating lots of non-profits and lots of community organizations on what is this? Why are people willing to pay you? What is they expect? Why is this 20-year period or 30-year period? Why do you have to commit to such a long period? Why? How does all of this benefit? Some external player somewhere else. And then why do you need such rigorous measurement? Why is it so? Why is the data requirement so high? And I'm telling you, one of the worst parts of this when things go wrong is that the cost of information collection for a farmer. It's and on the internet it all looks very nice, but when you ask data from a farmer, and in all parts of the world, getting land records updated, getting all their data updated, getting land allocated, all of that is a huge time investment by the non-profit, by the community leaders, and there's also a cost. There are multiple trips to district headquarters and state headquarters. So there's a cost to it. And then at the end of it, if things don't materialize, then farmers and everybody feels a sense of betrayal. So we thought, how do you avoid this mistrust? Now, how do you see farmers have been stewards of nature? When sequestration takes place, when trees are protected, when people shift to natural farming, there is a cost involved, a short-term cost involved. And therefore, I agree with what Violet said, that in a way, if you look at them not as an award, but as in a way a compensation or something which is, you're sort of paying them for being stewards of nature, for storing this carbon in a way. And so we then looked at the contracts, and I think that opened the whole world to us. And that's a lot of work we've been doing is on the contractual agreements. And there have been 3 areas which we have actually modified and changed the contracts on behalf of the farmers. The first is most of these contracts are very ambiguous in terms of benefits to the farmers. They put them in terms of percentage of a price which may be achieved, and therefore some part will go here, some part will go here, and some part will come to the farmer. So it's so ambiguous that farmers actually don't know exactly in dollar terms or rupee terms, what is it that if they do what they think they are contracted to do, what is the return they will get? So first is putting that on, and we had to negotiate a lot, but put it down on paper as much as possible, because some things are not known, the price may vary, but as far as possible, you put it down on paper. So that is one part. So the community should be fully aware as far as possible of what benefit the community gets. And that should be the key part of any contractual agreement. The second thing we realized that many of these contracts, while they, your carbon is something which you're talking about, but there's a lot of information which is flowing, right? A lot of data which is, and that data privacy is not really committed to in any contract. And therefore, we are negotiating for data ownership remaining with the farmers. And therefore, that part is very, very important, that maintaining the data privacy. And the third part, which is very important, is we've sort of put in a all-encompassing transparency clause. We are saying that all of this needs to be in the public domain. People need to know what we are signing, what the developer is signing, what the consultant is signing, who's getting how much money. Everything should be out in the public domain. Only when it is in the public domain, then you're talking about a real market. Otherwise, you are talking about a sort of a distorted market where a set of players have all the information, they have all the data, and another set of players, which are the key players, they suffer from information asymmetry. And I think so that work on contractual agreements between communities and the developers, I think, has gone a long way in at least making the field slightly more equal. And I think that's very important. Sometimes as non-profits, we are very good at raising our voices and talking on behalf, but finally there is a contract, and if we don't go deep into the contract and just think that, oh, we've said a piece and made a noise, but if the contract is lopsided, then the community and everybody suffers in the long run. So we've
Absolutely
paid a lot of attention to the contract, which is good. And some of the learnings we've had is a lot of learnings on the policy front. And one sort of question which I've always had is that we think that in all the players in this whole value chain, I'm never very sure that the non-profit, whether it's AKDN or WRI, are a part of this, or we are outside players trying to bat on behalf of one stakeholder. And logically, we should be a part of this whole value chain, which is there in government. We should be recognized. But the second part is that if the monitors and the auditors are paid as a percentage of the value of these whole transactions, then there is a bit of a sort of, I would say, conflict of interest here, because then the rigor of looking at the quality, the rigor of scale, whether the scale is achievable or not, because if there's more money, then people then overcommit on the scale, and then there are problems there. So I think if you can have systems by which the monitor or the auditor is not, in a way, is their compensation is not dependent on the value of the contract, but it's slightly separate, then I think you'll have slightly more rigor and slightly more transparency in this whole value chain.
And Apurva, let me just follow that up quite quickly, because there's some loads of interesting ideas in there, and this transparency point on data is very interesting, because it does provide quite an alternative way of contracting that is quite different from many private contracts that obviously are kept private. Whereas your suggestion is the real marketplace ought to have more transparency because it's a public good that you're creating. But that makes me think about the institutions of the state, whether it's at the national or regional or local level, and their role in this story. But perhaps you could just help us figure out the connection between the kind of interventions that you are making in a essentially charitable organization of some size and long history and great influence, and the politically democratic institutions of the country. How does that relationship work out in your experience, and how should it?
So, as you know, I think many countries in Africa, I think even Kenya, but definitely many countries in Africa, and India is definitely moving towards becoming a player in this whole carbon value chain. And I think it's still in process. So there is, I think, a couple of drafts of the legislation and have come out, but it's not finalized. But the way I would see the role of the state is, one is that you need a sort of a common registry at a national level. You can't have like 5-6 registries floating around.
Yeah.
None of them all siloed, and so therefore they don't really make sense. So the state has one role of a common registry and maintaining to make sure that there is no overlap, that there is no, all that stuff. How do you avoid that? Is one of that. That's one role. The second is when you have a lot of private players coming in, and the community is relatively, I would say, the weaker sort of partner in this whole agreement in many cases. Then how do you make sure that the contracts are enforceable? Because right now these are private contracts between a private agency and a group of farmers, or a private agency and with a non-profit as an intermediary. If God forbid something goes wrong and the investor goes bust or something, or anything goes wrong, then who is a player powerful enough to enforce reinforce the contracts? Who's going to make sure that these contracts are enforced? And I think there is a role of a national agency. So the trick with the whole government or national agency is that if it becomes too big, then it will just scare the investors away, because then there'll be so many procedures, etc., that the speed of this effort will get affected. But if you have no state, then also you have a problem. And therefore, I think if you have a state with very clear rules, one is a common registry, second is sort of enforcing the contracts, the third is actually making sure that the measurement agencies don't have a conflict of interest, and they're really objective and science-based.
Or at least there are some methodologies that you can agree on, and not 100. Okay, listen, we've got to move on. There's loads of interesting stuff there, but Yasmina's turn. So lots of references to data, accountability, citizens participating properly in processes. It's all good for integrity action.
Absolutely. And I'm sure without a doubt that Violet and Apova have set the scene and really captured the issues from that bottom-up community level so clearly that I think it's very difficult to disagree that without active involvement of communities and communities having a seat at the table, we can't have truly functioning VC, voluntary carbon market. And voluntary carbon market is not just important to companies, it holds one-off opportunity for communities to open new jobs, to lift people out of poverty. It can absolutely match what international development has been doing over decades. But people who are very active in the international development sector will eloquently tell you that this is nothing new in our space, but it still hasn't been achieved. How do you bring voices and action of communities and as an equal shoulder-to-shoulder player to policymakers is something that hasn't been fully, well, it has been tackled. There are loads of good examples, but even in international development sector that you would expect to be an expert here, it hasn't been achieved. But what I want to do is to really focus on those good examples, on bright promises and etc. And I deeply believe that integrity action holds and has been practicing over the last 20 years a model that shows one of the ways how to really bring communities to the table and make the whole set of stakeholders respond to them, but in a rational, in clear, effective and efficient way. Firstly, we have helped citizens in over 20 countries monitor over $1 billion worth of public products and services. Of all of those services and products monitored, out of all problems identified by communities, over 70% of them have been resolved within first 12 months of monitoring. So we do know that when you bring citizens to the table, problems get to be resolved and get to be resolved to the satisfaction of communities and stakeholders. So win-win solution does exist. We have taken the experience of that problem solving and our experience of bringing results and transparency in real time for everybody to see via technology platform. We have really demonstrated that problem finding and solutions can have actually incredibly important role in building trust between communities, stakeholders, and wider public. We all know that there are no problem-free events in this life. Problems are there, but how we resolve them and to what success is what matters. And we strongly believe that voluntary carbon markets need exactly solutions like this one to boost its own integrity. So over the past 2 years, what we have done is to translate everything that we know from this space and to apply it specifically in voluntary carbon markets. We're very much hoping to lift the first project in Nigeria, very keen to see as many stakeholders involved in this as possible. Because if we can bring voices of women that Violet is working with, for them to really understand what the promises are that are being made by project developers or off-takers, for all of that to be visible and accessible to everybody, and then for those women to say what works and what doesn't work, and for all of us to understand what the problems are and what effective solutions are, we can have a transformational solution to a problem that's Achilles' heel currently in voluntary carbon markets.
And one of the implications of what you've just said, Yasmina, is that for those who are interested in investing in the carbon market, and let's for now use voluntary when we all know it's quite possible that it might be mandatory or it will certainly be regulated. I mean, there are countries all over the world building their own carbon regimes. Just bear that in mind. Sometimes voluntary sounds a bit too loose when in fact it's all subject to law in some way or other. But one of the things that we know is happening is that investors, particularly corporate investors who have visible brands, are nervous about coming into this market because there are a lot of bad stories. There's some bad practice that's been around, and they don't really want to risk their reputation investing in a poorly structured and untrustworthy marketplace. So my sense is that what you're suggesting, Yasmina, is that by following the approach you're suggesting and using the data and the technology for gathering it, you can reduce risk of reputational harm. Is that really how you see it when you speak to potential investors in the corporate world?
Absolutely, absolutely. And in the past several months, we have spoken to a number of corporate investors and off-takers and etc. And without a shadow of a doubt in my mind, they all agree that if we had flow of data coming directly from communities, directly from community members, this is something that they would take as a very effective way of managing risks. Absolutely. And what I do know also is if you observe the whole discussion from an angle of people who are bringing the stories to public attention, their needs would also be satisfied if they knew there is objective, independent, at arm's length way of bringing information from communities. That would actually, and I've heard this from several of them, they said, well, this would actually enable us to bring positive stories to the forefront rather than just shouting about problems.
Yes. Because there are positive stories. I mean, what tends to happen is that you focus on the bad ones, and that creates an adverse reaction, and you miss the things that are going on that are actually beneficial and are to do with the flow of resources to places that have frankly had their practices as well as their land, as well as their natural capital attributes undervalued in ways that are not acceptable. So Jesse, I didn't give you quite as much time as the others, and you put some very interesting things in the chat. I wonder whether we just pick up a little bit of the procedural ideas that have been emerging in the conversation, like this notion of how you could be more open about procurement, like the idea that there may well be a connection between these community-based programs and the national government's commitments at the international level through Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is not yet done, but is heading in that direction and hopefully will be completed this year, because that does provide the sort of overarching international legal structures into which governments can cooperate to value carbon in whatever ways they choose. I wonder whether you could just have a few minutes, perhaps, just to respond to some of the conversation to date, and then I'll try and bring this inclusion. Look if any more questions perhaps have come through on the chat.
Yeah, thanks, James, and I really appreciated the deep rooting of this conversation in the context, especially in Kenya and with farmers. I think that I just wanted to I think in the chat that not everybody perhaps could see, I noted that the movement around making procurement more open, transparent, and participatory, public procurement, which in its own has massive climate relevance for low carbon transitions. While if you look at the governance indicators more broadly, there's been so much regression amongst so many indicators related towards democratic processes. That is one area that there's been a lot of movement around making tenders and awards more transparent and enabling so as a very real and practical example, if we think about the coal, like a proposed coal plant, or even a clean energy plant, those can have real community impacts, that obviously, very obvious community impacts. And when those tenders are made transparent earlier on, and it allows, I think it enables communities and civil society to have a better understanding of the rationale around these decisions, and to better be able to assess, like, what are some of the political economy barriers or interests or incentives or rent capture that's going on that's shaping these decisions around these major investments. And so I really like the point that these are public goods that we're talking about. And so the point that Apurva was making around the need to put these in the public domain, that addressing that critical asymmetry of information, and I think it builds, building on the point that Violet made about documenting everything. I think the critical thing, just to zoom back out on green accountability, is that, or accountability generally, is you need those elements of the information that is relevant, accessible, understandable, provided in a timely way, to enable participation, and with mechanisms like that tool that I really want to find out more about, that toll-free number that Violet was talking about, to when those mechanisms fall short, to be able to have a legitimate grievance mechanism with teeth behind it. So I think that having those three elements together is so important, and I really like those grounded examples. I think, we don't have, a fully agreed upon and implemented Article 6 yet, but I'm hopeful that these examples can lend some credibility and legitimacy of how this could be operationalized in a way that can start to build some additional trust and credibility in how communities can be engaged in a way that's ensured, not only from the start, but throughout the life of the project. And that time scale and time span is really huge. Yeah.
In fact, Apurva, I was just going to very briefly come back around before I wrap things up. That is also implicit in not just your remarks, but the others. The time dimension is critical, especially if it's a nature-based project. And I wonder whether you could just give a very brief response to the idea that maybe we would need insurance to be in place. And many places don't have access to insurance at all. But perhaps in these circumstances, one could create the conditions where insurance could be put in place to ensure that the work done happens over a long period of time. Otherwise, the environmental benefit is kind of illusory. And that goes also to a question that's come through on adaptation, because adaptation and resilience are also a part of these nature-based solution projects, aren't they?
I think this idea of insurance is a good one. In fact, I've been very, one of the things I've been looking for are examples of even insurance, climate insurance per se, irrespective of the carbon contracts.
Yes.
And there have been some good experiments. I've seen one experiment in Bangladesh on floods, and there's somebody working with pastoralists and early snow in Kyrgyzstan. So a couple of examples are there. But I think the insurance sector will need to be incentivized to take up some of these areas, right? Because there is a element of risk which they are also not familiar with, and therefore there is this fear in the insurance sector. Yeah. But I think if it is a part of this whole carbon financing deal, then I think insurance companies will be much more willing to come forth, because there is a sort of a revenue stream at the end of the day, which they can work with. So I think that idea of using insurance and imagining insurance products around this long-term, because you grow trees, let's say in the background you see those trees, right? And the communities plant them, you protect them, all of that you do, and then there is suddenly a flash flood or a landslide, and then the whole thing goes away. And so what happens to the community? I mean, forget the fact that they are devastated because what trees mean to them and to their soil. But in addition, they lose these kind of benefits for which they've also worked so hard. So
there are examples now.
Benefits of this. Yeah.
There was a launch yesterday of by an organization here called Howden, which I also work with, called Humanity Insured, which is about connecting people who don't have insurance. But there's also quite a lot of activity here in London about how to make insurance relevant to all of these issues and offer some kind of solution. Violet, can I turn to you just for a parting observation or comment before I close things off with some remarks? How would you like to leave the audience with a thought?
So I think I really appreciate we are all saying the same thing. That is very good for this panelist. And I really want to echo what most of you have said about timely sharing of information and how accessible this information is to the communities that are giving the information or the data, and even the civil society organizations that are working with this community, for the sake of being able to negotiate, because this is about negotiating, being able to negotiate from a point of understanding. And the other thing that I also really want to emphasize is how we are actually able to ensure that there is continuous dialogue that builds trust. So it's not just coming to register the farmers and then saying this is what we are going to give, and this. There has to be continuous dialogue, just like many of the nature-based solutions. Dialogue has always helped in monitoring and learning together. So this has to really be included in how we all learn together, both these companies and even the farmers. Thank you so much.
Very good. Well, that's as good a thematic ending as I could wish for, because everybody has focused on the essential element of trust. No trust, no marketplace, ultimately. These efforts to value carbon are exclusively for the public good. There may well be private gain in getting there, but the point of it is to deliver the public good. The public good is associated with solving the problem, a complex problem, which is extremely dispersed and involves climate change at the most dramatic is an existential risk. But equally, we want to be able to respond intelligently so that we don't have unintended consequences that deplete our natural resources and our biodiversity in foolish ways. So we have to bring biodiversity and community benefits into the story of climate change problem solving. And we've got to do it in many parts of the world, all at the same time, and in ways that we haven't really tested before. We've got to do a lot of learning very quickly and keep that learning spinning around so that people don't make mistakes. And that's a hell of a challenge, but it's worthwhile doing because we really are at risk. And this is just one of the routes by which we value the behaviors, the work done that binds us as a human race. And I do think that probably we won't get to the scale we need to have a meaningful response to climate change unless these systems are well regulated and probably mandatory. So that what we're learning with the voluntary carbon markets is just that, learning how to do this, learning what doesn't work, learning how to build the right procedures, what institutions we need, so that there's trust, so that there's fairness, and so that there's actual real-world problem solving rather than illusory and promises made on platforms that don't turn out to be real. That's probably enough from me as we hit the top of the hour. Thank you very much for all those who put this together and who are helping these messages go out to all the audience. And much appreciate talking to you, all of you speakers on screen, and I hope we stay in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.